Welcome to Arundel House. I'm Nick Redman. I'm the Director of Editorial here at the Institute. I'm delighted to say we have Professor Leif Wenar of Law School at King's College London. He's the author of Blood Oil. It's a book that has high pertinence to the work of IISS and the many strategic themes that we do. Coming as I did from the Economist Intelligence Unit, I spent quite a lot of time being acquainted with various aspects of the resource curse, Dutch disease, rent-seeking behaviour, but Leif's work focuses on questions that go beyond narrowly the economic realm. So he will talk for approximately 20 minutes, half an hour, somewhere around there. And then we'll go to questions. We're all on the record. Please phones to silent, but happy to tweet. Leif.
Thanks so much, Nick, and thanks so much for delighted us for hosting, and thank you for giving up what is a bit of a beautiful London day to talk about serious topics. So when I talk to the general public, I usually start by acknowledging that Western states have sometimes been very aggressive in oil-rich countries, that Western oil companies have sometimes been exploitative in oil-rich countries, and that because of climate change we need to get off oil just as fast as we possibly can. This is a very sophisticated audience. I'm not going to spend time on those points. I'm going to say, as you know, getting off oil will take a while because still oil is humanity's primary energy supply. 90% of the world's transportation fleet runs on oil. The world uses 1,000 barrels of oil every second. And not only is oil used for transportation, also anything that's plastic or synthetic, made of oil, might be in your glasses, it might be in your waistband, could be helping your sex life. Oil is everywhere. It's a big part of our economy. So I'm not going to spend time on those messages, which I imagine we would agree on if we were to discuss them. I'm going to talk about a deeper story from the book, which is how consumers are forced every day to fund much of the injustice and instability in the world that ends up in the headlines. Our own laws are forcing consumers to empower some of the world's most dangerous men when they fill up with petrol and go to the till. And to get into that deeper story, I'm just going to start by reviewing some of the most serious threats and crises that the West has faced in the past 40 years. I'm going to ask you to see if you can find something in common amongst the threats and crises that I show. So if you're as old as I am, you remember the Soviet Union surging ahead of the West in the nuclear arms race. Since 1979, the Iranian regime has sponsored terrorist groups from Hamas to Islamic Jihad. In 1990, Saddam Hussein destabilized the Middle East by invading Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. Gaddafi, behind terrorism from IRA to the Lockerbie bombers. Al-Qaeda, behind 9/11, and also planning for 7/7, Tavistock Square next to where I live, the genocide in Darfur. Closer to our time, the war in Syria, where Assad has been bombing and gassing his own people. Putin also bombing in Syria, intensifying a refugee crisis that's putting pressure on the politics of Europe. And coming closer to today, I'm not going to show pictures of Manchester or London Bridge, which are likely still fresh in your memory. What it does look like is that these attacks are another in a string of ISIS-inspired attacks across Europe, and we know that ISIS remains a threat to the West even as they lose territory. In fact, their attacks seem to be getting more frequent. Okay, well, did you guess the common factor behind all of those threats and crises? They all came from countries that export a lot of oil. And much of the money that went into those threats and crises, of course, came from us, from consumers, buying petrol and spending on things that are transported with or made with petroleum. So what's going on here? Why is oil correlated with so much trouble? Well, we get a clue from the political scientists who talk about the oil curse, the political oil curse. So here's a map of the countries whose primary commodity export is oil. And here's a map that in 2016, the Economist Intelligence Unit and Freedom House said were the oil states that are either authoritarian or failed. And there you see the world's main artery of oil, stretching from Siberia through the Caspian, Middle East, to West Africa. That's the oil curse. Now, you can see the oil curse in the fact that more and more of the world's civil wars are occurring in oil states in places like Syria and Iraq and Libya. And also in the fact that more and more of the world's autocrats are petrocrats across the former Soviet Union, Middle East, and Africa. And violence from oil isn't contained within borders. The data also show that revolutionary petrocrats like Saddam or Gaddafi are 3 times more likely to start foreign wars. Now, the humanitarian consequences of the oil curse are striking. So think of the tremendous development in many countries in the past generation, India, for example. In contrast to that, the major oil states outside the West are today, on average, no richer, no freer, and no more peaceful than they were even in 1980. And that's remarkable. Now, the West has, of course, intervened in some of these states, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But you can see that the oil curse is a systemic phenomenon that strikes countries that are otherwise quite different. What's driving this oil curse is a 17th century law in global trade left over from the days of the Atlantic slave trade. This is the law of every state that says it'll be legal to buy the natural resources of other countries from whoever can control them by force. This is a law that lawyers call effectiveness, that says for the resources of other countries, might makes right. So, 1969, when Gaddafi took over Libya in a coup, American law made it legal to buy Libya's oil from Gaddafi. And then years later, when rebels took over some of the same wells during the Arab Spring, American law made it legal to buy Libya's oil from the rebels. Now, that's such an ancient rule, we take it entirely for granted. But if you think about it, it doesn't make any sense, even from a market perspective. I mean, if an armed gang takes over the Texaco station down in Vauxhall, should British law give the gang the right to sell off the petrol and keep the money? No, that would cause chaos. But when Saddam's junta took over Iraq in a coup many years ago, British law made it legal to buy Iraq's oil from Saddam. And then years later, when ISIS took over some of the same wells, every country's law made it legal to buy Iraq's oil from ISIS. That's why sanctions laws were needed. The default law of every country today is the natural resources of other countries, whoever can seize them by force can sell them legally to us. Now, oil, as you know, is the world's largest traded commodity, but our laws say might makes right not only for oil, but for all natural resources. So in my phone, in your phone, there may be a small piece of the Congo that was extracted at gunpoint by one of those terrible militias in the Congo that have used sexual violence as a weapon of war so extensively that the Congo has become the worst country in the world to be a woman. But I can tell you, even if there are conflict minerals in my smartphone, I guarantee you I own this phone, every molecule, free and clear, 100% under the laws of the United Kingdom. Violence there literally turns into property rights here. And some of the money that I paid for this phone may have gone back to the militias to help them buy more bullets and more bayonets. So this ancient law puts consumers into legal business relationships with whoever can seize resources overseas. And for decades, those men have been causing a lot of trouble with our money. And you can see why. This old law of might makes right incites violence and oppression. I mean, just to take a thought experiment, imagine for a moment that the state of New York declares might makes right for all the goods in New Jersey. Imagine the New York legislature says, whoever can seize goods by force in New Jersey can sell those goods to New Yorkers, and New York's police and courts will enforce the resulting property rights. What do you think New Jersey would look like after a while? Well, crime kings, turf wars, syndicates, just the kinds of things we actually do see on a larger scale in resource-rich countries around the world. Since might makes right rewards control over oil with very large sums, it incites armed groups to fight for that oil, as we saw in Iraq in 2014, which descended into a war of oil against oil, as the Sunnis, Shia, and Kurds all sold crude to fund their armies. Since this law rewards control of oil with large sums, it empowers authoritarian regimes to dominate their countries with the muscle and the loyalty that oil money can buy, as we see, for example, in Russia or Iran. So here's the crucial political science point about oil today. Might makes right turns oil into the world's largest source of unaccountable power. Today, whoever can control oil by force will get a large sum of money. It's like a funnel of money descends into their hands. That money comes with no strings attached. It never has to be paid back. And of course, the money comes in beyond the control of the people of the country, who have to watch from behind fences as the national wealth of their country is sold off beyond their control. The unaccountable power of oil money enables authoritarians to buy, keep in office. It enables armed groups to start or intensify a civil war. And in the hands of some of the Gulf monarchies, as you may know, especially Saudi hands, this money has produced the 21st century's greatest historical anomaly, which is the spread of an Islamic fundamentalism over the past 40 years. What might be the largest ideological campaign in history. The Saudi regime has spent tens of billions of its petrodollars converting once tolerant Muslim communities worldwide to its intolerant version of Islam. And it's that fundamentalist Salafist ideology that has been mutating into homegrown jihadi extremism, not only in the Middle East and Asia, but in Belgium and in France, and it looks like now in Britain too. So a new analysis by my team of the Global Terrorism Database shows that the big spike in terrorist killings since 2001 is almost entirely due to extremists like ISIS, who hold to some variation of the Saudis' fundamentals. Now, of course, radicalization has many causes, and no one should say that the Saudis' global spread of Salafism is sufficient to explain extremism, of course. But if you saw Fareed Zakaria's show a couple weeks ago, this is the data that he relied upon to reach his conclusion that almost every terrorist attack in the West has had some connection to Saudi Arabia. So, once we see the oil curse as being a problem of unaccountable power, then you can see the West's strategies towards oil-cursed states as attempts to check the power of oil from outside the country. So in the past generation, the West has used three primary strategies to try to check the power of oil from outside. Sometimes the West has taken military action. Sometimes the West has tried alliances with authoritarian regimes, the Shah, Saddam, Gaddafi, the Saudis. How's that going? Sometimes the West has tried military action. Gulf War I, Gulf War II, Libya, cover the region with drones. Sometimes the West tries sanctions. Iran, Iraq, Sudan, Syria, Russia. After 40 years, what results have these strategies achieved? Even putting aside the deaths and the expense and reputational damage, how effective has it been for the West to try these strategies to check the power of oil and produce regional stability? Well, John Brennan last year, when he was the director of the CIA, gave his verdict in front of Congress. He said the Middle East is the worst it's been in 50 years, and the region faces unprecedented bloodshed. The unaccountable power of oil can't be checked from outside the country by the West or anyone else. So, we are in a bad place. This old law of might makes right sends hundreds of billions of dollars a year to violent and repressive actors. Oil-fueled authoritarians and armed groups have caused major instability for a generation. And unfortunately, it looks like the world is about to get even more oil-cursed. So the U.S. National Intelligence Council predicts that because of climate change, the oil-producing states, especially around the equator, are going to be getting hotter and hungrier and thirstier at the same time as they're going through a youth bulge and the region fills up with more powerful explosives and drones. Which is likely to mean that the Middle East will become even less stable than it is today. More popular discontent may be met with greater authoritarian repression, leading to the further spread of violent extremism. If importing states keep their law of might makes right for oil, the future may become like the past, only more so. So, is there any hope for change? Well, it'll be challenging. Maybe we're stuck where we are. But in fact, there is a chance that we could replace this bad old rule for natural resources that keeps sending us these impossible threats and crises. We know that this rule of might makes right can be abolished because humanity has abolished might makes right for other things many times before. And this is the optimistic part of the story. So think about it. 300 years ago, might makes right was the international rule not only for natural resources, but for almost everything in international affairs, even for human beings. So 300 years ago, every country's law for Africans was, whoever can seize them by force can sell them to us. And under that law, 12 million Africans were forced through the Middle Passage to the New World where they were bought legally as property. Back then, might made right for people. Even 100 years ago, might makes right made colonialism legal. The international rule was, Any state that could gain coercive control over a foreign population got the right to rule that population. Had the sovereign power. Might made right. Even in our own times, might makes right legitimized apartheid. The international rule was, if a regime could keep power over a population, it got the right to sustain a racist white regime. Might made right. Ethnic cleansing, even genocide used to be permitted by international law, which was little more than the legitimation of power. But now look, the good news is that in the 21st century, all of those things I just mentioned have become violations of international law. The slave trade, colonialism, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, genocide. These are now violations of international law. And in fact, the world has already abolished might makes right for a single natural resource, which is diamonds. Almost every major importing country now makes it illegal to buy diamonds which have been plundered by armed groups. Diamonds which have been violently extracted in one country are no longer legally bought in another. Now, of course, you might be thinking that in abolishing the link between might and right in law, we haven't magically abolished power, right? I mean, slaves are still secretly trafficked across borders, genocides still occur, blood diamonds still leak into global commerce. But the good news is that over 3 centuries, we have turned what used to be widely accepted practices of violence into widely reviled crimes. And this is where the political science becomes quite optimistic. Because the world is ready to abolish might makes right for natural resources too. At the level of ideas, at least, the world has already agreed on a principle that requires a government to be accountable for resource management. And it's nothing other than the principle that a country belongs to its people, that is, to all its citizens. On this principle, every country's natural resources start out in the people's hands, and anyone who wants to sell off those resources has to be accountable to the people when they do so. So if a government decides to allow private development of the resources, it has to be accountable to the people. If a government wants to sell off the resources itself, it has to be accountable to the people. Citizens have to have the bare bones rights and liberties for them to find out what the government is doing with their resources and effectively to protest that. If there's not that kind of accountability in place within a country, if anyone sells off the resources of the country without any possible accountability to the people, then they are literally selling off stolen oil or stolen minerals. Now, the good news is that in the 21st century now, that principle is widely affirmed. So in the book, I've got a list of politicians who just stand up and say, the oil belongs to the people. And it's not only Clinton and Bush and Blair, but Prime Minister of Australia, Parliament of Norway, presidents of Ghana, Mexico, Brazil, and even Ayatollah Khamenei. Everyone says the oil belongs to the people, and it's a natural thing for politicians to say. Because when we do the polls, majorities in every region of the world, including the Middle East, say that they support the idea that citizens should be sovereign over their own countries. And more good news, the treaties are already signed. Article 1 of both of the major human rights covenants just says all peoples shall, for their own ends, freely dispose of their natural wealth and resources. 98% of the people in the world live in a country that has already signed one of those treaties. So, let me be clear about this. It's convenient that popular resource sovereignty is declared in the major human rights covenants, but I would not come to IISS with an argument that rested solely on the moral imperative of respecting human rights, important as that is. My argument is a political science argument. My argument is a realist argument. Popular sovereignty over resources is the only feasible political science solution to the oil curse. The oil curse is a problem of power. Our current laws endow whoever can gain coercive control over oil with enormous unaccountable power. These men have been using the power to start civil wars, repress their citizens, to spread their intolerant ideologies. And that's been causing serious instability for the past 40 years. Looks like it's going to get worse. The power of oil can't be checked from outside the country through alliance or invasion or sanction. It can only be checked from inside the country by the people of the country who are living there on the ground every day. So, over the years, I've developed a group of policies under the name Clean Trade, which shows how importing states in the West can peacefully and responsibly align their own laws with their own principles. There's a lot of policies we could discuss. In the very short term, it would be helpful if our governments would just use the words that a country belongs to its people and governments should be accountable to their people when they sell off the resources. But in the medium term, Western states should begin to taper off their imports of oil from exporting states so long as their citizens lack the basic rights and liberties to hold their government accountable. So with these policies, our countries will only change their own laws on our own soil about who we buy oil from. We would say to a regime, for example, in Saudi Arabia, who rules in your country is none of our business, but because of our own principles, you will get none of our business for oil until you become more accountable to your people. That kind of policy is obviously not costless, but it's surprisingly economically feasible. The UK, for example, could end the imports of authoritarian oil and gas without much pain at the pump. In fact, it might help us to transition to alternatives, and we could do it without excessive costs. We just don't need to buy authoritarian oil anymore. For our own sakes, we should stop. Western states can take a peaceful, principled stand for the rights of all peoples. It'll encourage democratic reformers in oil-cursed states who are, I believe, the only hope for durable stability in places like the Middle East. And let me mention, I also think this is our best counter-radicalization strategy. As you know, extremists come from communities. And our countries, bearing some cost to stand with the ordinary people of resource-cursed countries, will make us a much less plausible target, and it will build us some trust, which we really need. Today, the peoples of oil-cursed countries are struggling against men who are using our own money to oppress and attack them. It's time to get out of business with those men and get on the side of the people. Now, to conclude, let me just say, I know that that is a big ask, and it might seem like might makes right for oil is just the way the world works, it's just the way the world has to work. But when you think about it, that's just how it seemed for the slave trade and for colonial rule and for blood diamonds. Humanity has now abolished its bad old law of violence for all of those practices, and we're ready to abolish that old law one more time. We could stabilize the global order by getting out of business with violent and oppressive men abroad. We can create a world beyond blood oil. Thanks very much.